You're listening to Bible Truth Feed, a podcast by christadelphianvideo.org for Christadelphians and all those seeking the truth about the Bible message. Join us now as we present our latest episode.
In all my years in the truth, I'd never heard a study on Joab. Maybe you have, and good on you if you have, because you can come and tell me some of the information that you might have marked in your Bibles about the study you have heard. But I do have to say this, that for the amount of times that Joab is mentioned in the Bible, and we'll have a look at this in a moment, and for the role that he actually played in David's life and in the lives of virtually the whole of the nation of Israel, you would have to seriously think, why haven't we heard more about Joab? And maybe it's because some people don't like to talk about people that go off the rails. I don't know about that either, because all scripture is given by the inspiration of God, and therefore we should be studying every character, whether good or bad, in scripture so that we can learn some lessons from them. But there is no doubt whatsoever that Joab is one of the most complicated or complex characters in the Bible. He's also at the same time one of the most colourful. He basically had the nation of Israel in the palm of his hand. No doubt at all when you look at the life of Joab that everybody admired him. The admiration of Joab was legendary, even to the point where David admired the man initially. After a while he worked out what he was really like and started to put two and two together, and it was all too late for David to control the man. But you cannot, and I think even here today, and looking back in some of these, the record of Joab, you cannot but admire the man's ability, particularly from the fact that wherever he went, he commanded attention from everybody. Everybody knew Joab at this period of time in Israel's history. He was undoubtedly loyal to David. There's no question about his loyalty. In fact, I was appreciative of Brother Fred handed me a few notes about, obviously he'd seen some information about Joab in the past and said, I don't know if you've seen this, but he points that out too. His loyalty was legendary in itself to David. Let's just make that point, to David, not to God, to David. And some of the other points that Fred says here, I mean, he was imperious, he was revengeful, he was unscrupulous. He was, as we've got on the screen, merciless. He was a manipulator. And all of those are pretty negative words. There's nothing positive about those characteristics whatsoever. And he had the whole gamut of those type of characteristics in his life. But at the same time, he garnered the admiration of everybody. And even when we look back, we go, wow, what a man. And as Fred says in his notes here that he gave to me, Joab was a man not to be messed with. If you want to have someone in your corner, for whatever reason, you want Joab in your corner. You don't want him in the opposing corner. That would be suicide. It would be absolutely dreadful if that was the case. You want Joab on your side. David knew that. He knew it. And so, whilst he was immensely loyal to David, in fact, we would go so far as to say this, there was at least two opportunities that he could have usurped the kingship from David. At least two opportunities he could have pushed David aside and basically taken the role of being a king. But he wouldn't have anything to do. He would have nothing of that. It never really entered his mind. He was never wanted to be a king. That was not what he wanted to do. He wanted a position of elevation in an area that he excelled in. And he was the greatest military warrior that Israel had, probably the greatest. But as we said, there was something intrinsically wrong with Joab's character. And it was really a sad demise of the man when you overlook his character as a whole, because there was a man that had really a brilliant opportunity to become potentially one of the greats of all time in Israel's history. No doubt about that. But it ended up being a mitigating disaster because of the way in which he really thought things through and acted upon those thoughts. So what do we know about his background? Bit of a lineage of Joab. Well, of course, it starts right back, Boaz and Ruth, and comes down, of course, through Obed and Jesse. And Jesse, of course, has a number of sons, as we know, and David was the youngest of his sons. Quite a few of them there on the screen. You can see them there. But there was also two sisters that David had. And those two sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. And from those two sisters, particularly one of them, comes the main player, of which we're going to be discussing over the next 2 nights. And she had 3 sons, actually. She had Joab, of course, she had Abishai, and she had Asahel. Now, in the first record of when you start looking at the sons of Zeruiah, Abishai is named first. So normally you would understand that Abishai was the oldest, but it's only mentioned once, Abishai first. From there on in, all the mentions of the sons of Zeruiah, Joab is put first. Now, perhaps Abishai may have been the oldest, but one thing we do know without a question of any doubt whatsoever is Joab was the most prominent of those 3 brothers. Absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. And of course, Abigail had a player as well that comes into the story, and his name's Amasa, which happens to be Joab's cousin. So when you look at that family tree, it doesn't take too long to work out that David is the uncle of Joab. However, Zeruiah, the older sister of David, possibly the half-sister, different mother, but probably considerably older than David, it's fair to say that Joab and David may well have been about the same age. Some have suggested Joab was probably older. We don't really know, but it doesn't matter. Well, we know is that Joab and David probably grew up running around the backyard together, because they're uncle and nephew, but they're roughly the same age. So they've known each other right from childhood. And that goes to say something really on behalf of both of those men, because David did admire Joab initially. There's no doubt about that. And Joab could see something very special in his uncle, who was the same age, and they probably played a little bit in the field, but they soon left their various ways, in which areas they were heading off into. But there is a connection there right from the word go. So what do we know about these 3 men, Joab, Abishai and Asahel? If we were to try and find descriptive words that would tell us of what they were really like, it's not hard to find them. Joab was fearless, he was heroic, he was a strong individual, physically strong and mentally very strong as well. He was very loyal to David, and I'll keep harping on that. Very, very loyal to David. Highly intelligent and very clever. But he was vengeful, he was brutal, he was merciless, he was manipulative, and he was cunning. Very cunning. He knew where he was heading in life, brothers and sisters and young people. He knew exactly where he was heading. That man, Joab, had 2 ingredients that you don't often see in a very strong man. He not only had brawn, he had brains, all right? Sometimes the 2 don't go together. He had brawn, muscles, and brain to go with it. Abishai, his brother, equally as fearless, heroic and strong. He's known in Scripture as a great one-on-one fighter. He was a really terrific man. He was the one, as again we might see if we got time a little bit later, that said to David when he went down with David to confront Saul, and Saul was fast asleep. He's the one that said, David, I only need to hit him once. He'll never get up again. You know, he was the one-punch man that says, if I hit someone, they're not going to get up again. So he was a strong individual, great one-on-one fighter. He was very loyal to David. Now, Asahel, on the other hand, is again fearless. He's very heroic. These men are all part of David's mighty warrior team. He's slim and athletic. He's not like his brothers. He's not built like a Sherman tank, all right? He hasn't got the bulging muscles and the 10 axe handles across shoulders, all right? He's not like that. He's slim, he's athletic, because he can run as quickly and as fast as anybody in Israel. Very, very fast indeed. He wasn't the smartest of the three brothers. The very way in which he was killed, as we read here tonight, would show he wasn't terribly clever. He didn't think things through very, very easily. But there's the three boys of Zeruiah, the three sons of Zeruiah. And, you know, when they came into David's life officially, which we'll have a look at that in a second or two, here's how David really describes these men and others that were with him. He says, my soul, he says, I'm among lions. I lie among those that are set on fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows and their tongue a sharp sword. These men were extremely tough and extremely brutal. Maybe not so much Asahel, but at the end of the day, he was surrounded by these types of people. Now, what about Joab? We did mention that he was the most prominent of the three, even though perhaps he was not the oldest. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because Asahel's taken out of the picture pretty quickly. So it leaves the other two, all right? It's Joab and Abishai. And Abishai was chosen by David on a number of occasions to do specific things, not Joab. So you would think, who's the most prominent? There's no doubt in Scripture that Joab is the most prominent. Now, how do we know? The first place his name is mentioned, come with me, is in 1 Samuel chapter 26. I want you to have a look at this. Just turn back a few pages. 1 Samuel chapter 26. Now, this is the time, and I'll just mention that previously, just very briefly, of some time after when they'd confronted Saul in the cave of En-Gedi, and they cut off a piece of his garment, and they confronted Saul and said, hey, you know what, we could have killed you, but we didn't kill you. And Saul was very apologetic and very remorse, but it didn't take long for him to start thinking evil thoughts against David as well. Again, and so he's chasing David down, and this time they get to the wilderness of Ziph. And again, David has the opportunity to kill Saul. God causes a deep sleep to come on the army of Saul and Saul himself. And David can see that here's my opportunity to actually see how far we can go. And he went down into the camp and he asked, first of all, before he goes, he asks who wants to come down with me into the camp. And it's Abishai that actually puts his hand up and says, I'll go. I'll actually go. And that's in verse 26 of 1 Samuel chapter 26. Have I got the right quote? Verse 6. Then answered David and said to Ahimelech, the Hittite, and to Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Now note the next three words. This is the first time Joab's name's mentioned. Brother to Joab, saying, who will go down with me into the camp? And of course it's Abishai that says, I'll go down with you. Why is that put in there, in the record, that Abishai is the brother to Joab? The reason is Joab had already made a name for himself. Abishai was a brute of a man. He was tough. Everyone loved Abishai too. But did you know who his brother is? His brother's Joab. Whoa, well, say no more. If his brother's Joab, Abishai must be pretty good as well. I mean, there's the first reference to Joab. And it's put in connection to the fact that Abishai said, I'll go with you. And of course, Abishai makes that great statement, I'll deal with Saul. He'll never get up. I'll only have to hit him once. I only got to pin him to the ground with my spear and he won't get up. But everybody said, Abishai's going. That's Joab's brother. So we're getting a picture straight away that Joab has a particularly prominent role right at this very early moment in the story. Very prominent from the get-go. I want to just show you how popular Joab is in Scripture. I was fascinated by this. the popularity of his name in Scripture is quite extraordinary. Here's a few names of others that are very popular in Scripture and how many times their names appear. Adam, Noah, Elijah, Elisha, Isaac, Samuel, Josiah, Hezekiah, one of the greatest kings of Judah. Have a look how many times they're mentioned. You come to Joab, and Joab's mentioned 146 times in the record. So let's not discount Joab as if he's not some person of note and that he just happens to be a fleeting person in the background of David's life or in Israel's history. Not at all. He's an extremely prominent character in the Bible and particularly in this time in Israel's history. So what do we know about his mother? Not a lot. Zeruiah, David's older half-sister. Her name means pain or tribulation of the Lord. She's got the three sons, Joab, Abishai, Asahel. On many occasions, brethren and sisters, young people, these three are always linked to their mother's name. Why is that? Why is it whenever you see Joab's name, not all the time, but in many occasions, why is it linked to his mother's name? Well, I think it's quite interesting, to be honest with you, because we don't know much about Zeruiah. We know nothing about Joab's father. Perhaps he died young, I would suggest. Perhaps she was a widow trying to raise three sons. But in Scripture we do know this. The phrase sons of Zeruiah is mentioned 24 times. 15 of those times in connection to Joab only. So if we thought Joab was pretty prominent, Zeruiah must have made a name for herself somehow. How? What is it that they always linked it to? Oh, they're the sons of Zeruiah. Well, she was obviously a very dominant parent. Very tough mum. She must have become very, very well known in the history of Israel and at the chronological time that Israel's going through all this period, that she was the mother of those three outstanding sons that excelled in military prowess. So I dare say she was pretty proud of her boys. Her boys were coming up through the ranks, and from an early age they were showing some pretty decent signs that they were going to be great men in Israel's history and at that particular time. Now, the meaning of her name might give us a little bit of indication that she probably had a pretty torrid time raising these three boys. And I think mothers that just have boys, and my daughter's got one of them, it's not an easy, it's a pretty ongoing battle to bring up boys. Boys are odd, you know. Girls, they tend to do their little things and read their books and, you know, comb the dolls' hairs and do everything. Boys are out there setting fires, all right? They're doing stuff right. And you can imagine these three boys, if they ended up the way they did end up as being huge military giants and heroes, could you even begin to imagine what it would have been like for a mum on her own to be bringing up those boys? So that her name probably gives us an indication she had it pretty tough. But she got them to a point where they had excelled themselves to be very notable heroes in Israel's history. Now, what was it about Joab that he loved David so much? And he did. He loved David. He really did. It's a shame he couldn't see the spiritual side of David enough to compel him to love who David loved the most, which was God. He didn't see that. He just saw the man David. And you've got to say to yourself, what was it about David that he really liked? Well, as we said, they grew up together. I think it wouldn't have been too long before, if they were the same age, before they parted ways. You know, they probably got to teenagers, and David was learning how to play the harp and looking after the sheep out in the field, and Joab's out there shooting arrows into bull's eyes and tomahawks splitting trees in half, and going to the gym every night and flexing his muscles, and he's becoming strong. So the two of them really parted ways probably fairly early in their vocation of where they were heading in life. But there was something about David that Joab obviously did think about and understood was his ticket, if you like, for a good future in the way he wanted his future to go. Now, I'd suggest it was this. David was anointed 3 times as a king. The first time, of course, was in the presence of his family, when Samuel anointed him when he was only a young teenager. The second time, as we learn in our reading tonight, when he was anointed to be king over Judah. And the third time, when in the presence of all Israel, when he became king over the entire tribes. And Joab witnessed all 3 of those. I think he definitely probably would have witnessed the first one, because he's part of the family. And if this big special event that Samuel was doing in front of the family, probably Joab was there looking at it. Certainly was there for the next 2. And I think from a very young age, when Joab, he had enough spirituality to know that if God is with David, then if I attach my wagon to him, I'm going to go places. And right from a very early age, I think Joab had some sort of admiration, or a great deal of admiration, which turned into 100% loyalty for David, because he knew that riding on David's coattails would give him the future he wanted. And he wanted to be a prominent military powerhouse in Israel. And what better way than to be a stand-up, outstanding military hero than to be captain of the army? That's all he ever wanted. Didn't want to be king. I just want to be the captain of the army. And I want to be remembered as that great man that led the IDF, the Israeli Defence Forces of that time. So he rode all the way on the coattails of David, because he could see there was something special about that man. And I believe he did love David, and I believe he became very loyal to him, but it wasn't for godly or spiritual reasons. It was totally to get his own life where he wanted it to be. Unfortunately, David picked up on that not too far into the union of those 2 men, and it was too late. He couldn't do anything about it. He just watched this whole disaster unfold. Now, Joab's name means Yahweh is my father. He never lived up to that at all. Yahweh was never really his father, because if Yahweh was his father, he would have worshipped Yahweh. I'm not suggesting Joab didn't have faith. He did. In some places, he in the record, he answers very faithfully some of the problems that comes his way. He does. And I'm not suggesting he didn't believe in God. Of course he believed in God. He had that certain spirituality that connected with God, but it wasn't a love for God. It wasn't as though God was his father in that spiritual sense. He just couldn't see that. He just saw his immediate own life and where it was going, and how he wanted to get to exactly where he wanted to be. I mean, we know David was a man after God's own heart. You would say Joab was a man after his own heart. And that's how you have to really see how Joab actually was. He was brilliant, but he was also brutal. He was always mindful of David, very mindful of his welfare, but he was also very manipulative of David. He could be guided. He could be summed up as a man who was guided after his own instincts, not after godly values. And those instincts, of course, led him to 1 or 2 words: self-preservation. That was it. I'm in this to preserve myself, and I will do anything that needs to be done to make sure I get what I want. And that was, and you're going to see this time and time again, that was to get to be the top dog in the IDF and to maintain that position. We're going to see that didn't quite work his way for a little while, but don't worry, he actually was able to claw back that position a few times. Now, let's have a look very quickly at the 40-plus year timeline of Joab. Now, we can go 70 years, really, because he was, if he's David's age and he died not long after David died, then it's roughly a 70-year period. But let's just pick out the highlights in Joab's life during the prominent years of David's life, 40 years, and just have a little look at this association they had. So the timeline is, the first time we sort of understand where Joab came into the life of David was when he was part of the 400 men that entered into the cave with David. The second part, of course, was what we read tonight. There's a real lapse of information between connecting with David in the cave of Adullam and then this particular chapter that we have here in 1 Samuel, or our reading tonight, 2 Samuel chapter 2. There's not a lot of information about Joab, but this is where we start to be introduced to Joab in all his brutality. So he accepts this contest to fight Abner's men, and there's a civil war that takes place. He kills Abner for killing Asahel, his brother. These are main events, by the way. There's a lot of other little things that went on, but we're just taking the main events because we've only got 2 studies. He takes Jerusalem and he becomes captain of the army. He's already captain, by the way, but he loses, as we'll show in a minute. He's a military genius. Honestly, he is quite a clever man. And you team him up with Abishai and you get all the other wonderful, heroic warriors at the time, and there was no army that could take on these two, particularly Joab in charge. Well, we know he was complicit in covering up David's sin with Bathsheba. These are all in chronological order. He stays loyal to David but kills his son that David loved, Absalom. He kills his cousin Amasa to rescue back the position he's always wanted. He sides with Adonijah against Solomon. Big mistake. And finally, of course, the picture of him dying at the holding of the horns of the altar, pleading for mercy. That's the last picture we really have of Joab. Quite an interesting life, really, isn't it? Some really good highlights there, but let's just have a look at this first one. He joins David as part of the 400 men in that cave. Now, we know the story about this. David is all alone, all right? He's relatively young. He's fleeing Saul. Saul's after him to kill him. He just can't stand David. David ends up, of all places, in the Philistine territory. He ends up in the presence of the king of Gath, Achish. And then he has to get out of there because that turns pear-shaped. And he's running from 2 enemies now. He's got the Philistines after him. He's got Saul after him. He's a young fella. He hides in a cave and he pours out his heart to God and says, God, I don't know what to do. I've got nobody around me that's supporting me. I need people. This is one of the Psalms he wrote. I need people in my life. And he no sooner offers this prayer to God, and he looks up and suddenly his family's walking through the cave, and 400 men as well. There's no doubt that Joab and Abishai and Asahel are part of that 400 men. And they all come into this cave with David. And you would say, whoa, David had his prayers answered. David might even say, yes, I've had my prayers answered. How fantastic. Now make no mistake about it. These 400 men did not come into that cave to sing hymns and do the Bible readings with David. That was out of the question. They were not there for that. And it's not as though they rushed in there because they thought David was a lovely, lovely person to be with. They rushed in there because they hated Saul. And this was an option that we're looking at. So they all went into the cave. They hated Saul so much. And this is what David says about them. He says about these men. He says, these were the men that were in distress. They were all in debt and they were all discontented. The 3 Ds, distress, debt, discontented, unhappy. And they gathered themselves to David. And he became the captain over. Notice that? David became the captain over them. About 400 men. Those 400, by the way, grew into 600 men. And Joab is part of that team. So we can say Joab is very distressed. For whatever reason, he had this axe to grind against Saul. He obviously owed money, and he was extremely unhappy. And perhaps a little light bulb moment came on in his mind and said, David, of course, I was at his first anointing. You know, maybe that's a good option. Perhaps I'll join with him. And I think Joab was prominent enough to garner these 400 men to head down there, to be with David. And they all went down there with David. So Joab's distressed, he's in debt, he's discontented. The men end up in 600 men. The whole lot of them become absolute fine warriors. To the point where David had wanted to name all these warriors in Scripture. And he named the head of all these different warriors that he had. And he said, and we haven't got time to look at this. And he said, I say, Eliphaz, here, you are one of the great men. Shema, you're one of the great men. And then he puts them in groups in the Chronicles records, and he's naming them all. And the one he just can't bring himself to name in the Chronicles records, who was arguably the greatest of all the warriors he had, he could not bring his hand to his pen to the paper to write the name Joab. Joab is left out of the Chronicles record as being one of the mighty warriors on record. David just could not bring himself to name Joab. Why? He didn't deserve to be there, brethren and sisters and young people. He did not deserve to be mentioned amongst the mighty ones, even though arguably he was the greatest of all of them. David knew from a spiritual point of view he was destitute, and he showed nothing to do with godliness whatsoever, whereas all the others obviously did. So he was not mentioned at all. Now remember how we said Joab's sole purpose in life was to become the head of the IDF? Well, that is true, because he actually held that position 3 times. He was fired twice, all right? 3 times he was head of the IDF, the Israeli Defence Forces. 2 times he was actually fired. We're not told specifically on one of the occasions that he was fired, but we assume it did actually happen because he lost his position. And yet he just kept on bouncing back. You think about this. Here's the times that he was captain of the army. Joab was in charge right at the start of this civil war. We just read that David was captain over them. Well, no, not for too long, because Joab usurps that role very quickly. That's what he wanted in life, to be the captain of the army. And when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 2, which we had read tonight, we can see immediately Joab's in charge. He is in charge. In fact, this whole contest that happens in 2 Samuel chapter 2 instigates the civil war between Judah and the rest of the tribes. But he loses that position after he kills Abner. Not told specifically he lost it, but we do know he loses it because he regains it again when he is the one that captures Jerusalem. Then he loses it again after he kills Absalom. Because David says, I can't deal with this anymore. You guys, you sons of Zeruiah, my sister, you're too hard for me. But one thing I'm absolutely going to have happen is, Joab, you've lost your position, and Amasa, you've got the position. So Joab's cousin becomes the next captain of the IDF. But of course, he regains that position after he murders Amasa. Now, Joab's one of these people that just keeps bouncing back. You just cannot hold him down. You have to be pretty brave to even attempt to do that, wouldn't you? I look at Joab, I don't know if you have to be old enough to remember this. I don't think they'd make these things anymore, but they used these clowns that you would blow up. You blow them up and then you fill the base with water, and you'd punch this clown in the face and it'd go, woo, boom, straight back up again, and you'd give it this great big whack thinking, I'm going to knock this thing and it's never going to rise again, a bit like Abishai, and you give it an almighty, and then bang, up it comes again. Joab is like that in the story of David. He just keeps coming back. You can't stop him. And it became a curse to David. David just didn't know what to do with pulling his hair out. And, you know, it doesn't matter how many times he said, "You're fired," boom, up he comes again. He finds another way to get back into the position he wants. He just cannot hold that man down. And David, the greatest king of Israel, one of the greatest at least, could not contain him. So let's have a quick look at this first revealing of Joab in our reading tonight in 2 Samuel chapter 2. This is where Joab comes to the fore. Now remember how it said back in the, when they all came to the cave of Adullam, that David said, "Oh, I'm going to be their captain." Well, he's not captain in this story. We don't know exactly how long after this is, but it's a little bit after, and this is where we are. Let's just remember, Saul's dead, Jonathan's dead, so there's a bit of disarray going on in the kingdom in the north, and David's made king over Hebron, so he's king over Judah, and the headquarters were in Hebron, but the northern tribes are in disarray. They don't know what to do. And it's really interesting when you read this, and you'll notice I did start at verse 5. I probably could have read the whole chapter, but when you read these particular verses here, David's showing kindness to the men of Jabesh Gilead because they in turn showed kindness to rescuing in the bodies of Saul and Jonathan. But when you get down to verse 7, he actually says at the last part, he says, "Oh, by the way," he says, "I've been anointed king over Judah." Just letting you know that, get the word out there, I'm now king of Judah, because obviously what David wanted to do was weld the entire tribes together under his rulership. But, and that's exactly how verse 8 starts, but Abner had different ideas, didn't he? Yes, Saul was gone, yes, Jonathan was gone, and Abner had different ideas, and he sets up one of Saul's other sons, Ishbosheth, to be the king over the northern tribes. Now Abner, you've got to understand a little bit about Abner. We'll get to him in a second, but be assured of this. Even though David greatly mourned over that man, he was not squeaky clean like we perhaps think he was. He had some ulterior motives here that is very clear that he wanted to be the king. At least the king over the northern tribes. Ishbosheth was a weak man, an absolute weakling, especially compared to Abner. So let's have a look at what happened in this story. As we said, Saul's dead, Jonathan's dead. Abner sets up the weak king Ishbosheth as king with ulterior motives, and we'll show that in a moment. And he's now ready to test out this army of David, these mighty men. So he puts out a contest. He puts out a challenge. He says in verse 12, "Hey, listen, why don't we all meet together at Gibeon, the pool of Gibeon, and let's just sit around and just, chew the cud and have a little bit of a chat and see where we're at with everything." So Abner's there with a few of his mighty men. Joab's there with his two brothers and a few mighty men he'd picked, and they're all meeting at the pool of Gibeon. And they're sitting around, and Abner says, why don't we have a little bit of a fight? You pick some of your best men, dozen of your best men, and I'll pick a dozen of my best men, and let's have a little bit of a fight and see who's the strongest. Now, Abner's not doing this just as a bit of entertainment. He's doing this and he's psyching himself up to work out how good it's the strategies of Joab and his men versus him and his men, because Abner's got a few little ideas in his mind of where he wants to go in life. But he knows he's up against somebody that has a huge, prominent name, not only down in the southern areas of Judah, but all throughout the land. Joab's got this reputation not to be messed with. As Fred said, he's a man not to be messed with. And Abner knows that, so he's putting it all to the test. Rather bizarre fight takes place. Really quite weird, isn't it? They pick a dozen men each, and in they go for the battle, and each of them grab the beard of the other and pull their sword out and stab each other, and they all fall down dead. I'm sure there might have been a slightly bit more of fighting going on, but the record just says that it was over pretty quickly. And it would indicate that even though the whole lot of those men died, that Joab's men obviously showed some sort of supreme excellence in the fighting sphere, to the point where Abner, he's been beaten, it says in verse 17. This is not going good. Let's head out. This is the commencement of the civil war, all right? And he's fleeing like crazy to get away from the scene. And Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, and this is where he's not too bright, are all chasing after Abner, particularly after Abner. Now, again, we're not going to the story. I'm sure you are all well connected with the story, except you need to come to verse 22, because it tells us here again of the prominence that Joab had. Asahel is chasing after Abner on foot. Abner's on his horse. I can't imagine keeping up with a horse, so maybe he was on a mule. Whatever it was faster than most people could ever run, but not with Asahel. He's as fast as they come. He is the Usain Bolt of the history of Israel, all right, in that time period. And he is chasing after Abner, and he's not letting go. And Abner's warning him, hey, Asahel, don't do this. It's not going to go. It's not going to end very well if you keep doing this. And he's telling this young man not to do it. Asahel, I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to be a hero. Why don't you just stop and go after those people over there? They're easier targets. Go and get them. You'll make a name for yourself. Stop chasing me. You're not going to win. I'll end up killing you. He's not going to give up. I'm going to get a medal because I'm going to get Abner. I'm going to get the captain of Saul's army, captain of Ishbosheth's army now. I'm going to get hold of him. Oh, my brother's going to love me. He's not thinking terribly clearly, is he? He's not a smart cookie in this record. He doesn't stop. Have a look at what is said in verse 22. And Abner said again to Asahel, turn thee aside from following me. Wherefore should I smite thee to the ground? I'm going to kill you if you don't stop. And then what he says is, how then should I hold up my face, not to Abishai thy brother, to Joab? I'll never be able to face Joab again if I do this. There is a huge respect for Joab when you read that verse. I don't know what I'll do if I confront Joab after I've killed you. This is going very badly, Asahel. You need to stop what you're doing right here and now. Bam. There comes the spear. The back of the spear goes straight into Asahel, comes out of his back, kills him on the spot. And they all come there, and the whole of the group all arrive, and Asahel fell down and died right there and then. And Joab and Abishai pursued after Abner. So Joab was not going to give up his pursuit after Abner, even though his little brother had been killed. And don't ever think that Joab forgot that. And don't ever think that he took Abner out to protect David. He took Abner out for vengeance, total 100% vengeance. But having said that, there were 3 men in David's life that had to be taken out of the picture if David was to succeed as king. 3 men. There were more, but there's 3 main players that needed to be gone. And here they are. The first one's Abner. Abner had to go. He was not squeaky clean like I used to think he was, because David mourned for him, so maybe he was a wonderful, wonderful person. Abner's one, we know about Absalom, and the other one's Sheba. We're not even going to deal with Sheba, but Sheba cursed David, and it was a thorn in the side of David. We know all about Absalom. We'll get to him next week. But Abner, what was the story with Abner? Well, first of all, those 3 men had to be taken out of David's life, and Joab took the whole 3 of them out. He took them out, and others as well, but he took the whole 3 of them out. Now, why Abner? What was it about Abner? Well, Abner, his name means father of light. He was Saul's uncle, so he was a considerably older man with a wealth of experience in the army and in the defence forces. He was a captain of Saul's army. The record tells us he was very courageous, a very experienced soldier. Now this is what I was never fully aware of, but you can read between the lines, and I think it's a very fair assumption to make this. He was the one probably goading Saul to keep on hunting David. And even though Saul's character was that he wanted to get rid of David anyway, you get a man in the position of Abner, the captain of your army, saying, don't give in. Keep hunting that man down. You'll never succeed if you don't get rid of David. And when you look at the record, when David confronts Saul on that time when Abishai was with him, and we haven't got time to look this up, he makes the point, he says, Saul, if this be of God and you're chasing me, I can accept that. But if this is of your own men that are whispering in your ear to keep chasing after me and to kill me, then we got to deal with that. Now, who did David have in mind that was like that? Well, I think Abner was like that. And we can add proof to that by the fact that when Ishbosheth was made king by Abner grabbed Ishbosheth by the back of the neck and plonked him on the throne and said, you're going to be king now. All right, this is your duty. Oh, okay. Because he was a weakling. There was no doubt about that. And he wasn't going to argue with Abner, but it wasn't long after that Abner actually took one of Saul's concubines. And we all know what that means, because Absalom did the same to David, took one of Saul's concubines to himself. That's a symbol of, I've got my eyes on usurping authority here. And Ishbosheth confronted him and said, hey, I know what that means. You don't need to be doing that. That's my concubine now. I inherited her. You do not need to be dealing with my father's concubine. And Abner didn't go, oh, I'm so sorry, King. Please forgive me. He said, you need to close your mouth. How do you think you even got here in the first place? I put you here. You just keep your mouth closed. Oh, Ishbosheth doesn't render any resistance whatsoever. Okay. So Abner has ulterior motives. He knows where he wants to go. Joab knows where he wants to go. David's in the middle, and he's watching all this play out. He kills Asahel, as we've just learnt. He then comes into the camp to make a pact with David. And I would sincerely suggest that Joab's correct when he says, don't you know, David, that Joab's coming in just to test out and find out what's going on here so that he can work out how to regroup and perhaps deal with the confrontation in a very negative way. David doesn't necessarily agree with that, of course, and we know that he's killed by Joab. And we won't go into the fact how Joab killed him, but yes, we will. Come over to this. Come over to 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 30. Here's the reason Joab killed Abner. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, slew Abner, not because of the pact he made with David, not because perhaps Joab could see right through that pact, not for any other reason than an absolute vengeful act. You killed my brother, I am going to kill you. Because that's what it says. He killed Abner because Abner had slain their brother Asahel. So we're getting this bit of a picture of Joab coming to the fore very early in this particular part of David's life, before he's even king of Israel, where Joab is very, very keen to get the position he wanted and to maintain and hold that position come what may. Now, I was going to go into the next section, but you know what? I'm going to end here because next week we'll get into the position. By the way, it doesn't necessarily suggest to us here that he lost his position as the captain of the army. We know he did lose it, but we're not specifically told he lost it. But we do know he lost it, and he regains it again because he's the one that puts his hand up to take Jerusalem. Well, we'll show you that next week and how that all panned out. But suffice it to say this, brethren and sisters and young people, we're starting very early in Joab's life to really get this mental picture of what the man truly is like and what's motivating him. And what is motivating him is his own heart, the own direction he wanted to go in. And he was very, very keen, brothers and sisters, very, very keen to reach the prominence of his profession, which was to be the captain over the army. And he was going to keep that position come what may. That was all he ever desired. So next week we're going to continue on about this man, the merciless manipulator, and just have a look at how everything starts to unravel for the man. You know, it was about halfway through this study that I realised that, in preparing for this study, I realised that I'd bitten off a little bit more than I could chew. I was rather ambitious in thinking that we could do Joab justice in doing just two nights. And to rub salt into the wounds, Brother Paul Hadley, who's Colin's brother-in-law, is he from Sydney, Colin? Sydney. Must have been tuning in last week, and he said, I did Joab years and years ago, which is really nice to know someone else has done Joab. And he said it took me 4 nights, and he sent me his comprehensive notes. You should have seen them. There was so much good information. Thanks, Paul, if you're watching, by the way. And I thought, oh, wow, what do I do now? But it is what it is. We've got 2 nights, so we're going to continue on full speed, and that's why we're only just grabbing the highlights of Joab's complex character as we continue this particular study. Now, we left Joab last week having killed Abner, and much to the angst and distress of the great King David. And when I say the great King David, he was a great king, but he seemed very powerless against Joab. He was deeply upset that Joab had killed Abner. And Joab had acted with complete disregard and complete impunity. Even though we know that Abner had to be out off the scene, it was the method and the way in which Joab goes about his particular job. And it was such a thing that when David was following after the coffin of, if you like, of Abner as he's being buried, and he's quite saddened, and all the people can see that David's not implicated in this, that Joab is. And as David's following down after the coffin, he talks about Abner as being slain at the hands of the wicked. So he's grabbed hold of Joab straight away and he's pocketed him straight into that wicked little envelope. You're a wicked man, Joab. And he says this. He says, I am the chosen king, but Joab and Abishai have more power than I do. Now that's a pretty bold statement. So God will have to pay them back for the evil things they did. Now, you'll notice he's grabbed Abishai in this, because Abishai was there when Abner was killed. But it was Abner's decision, it was Abner's knife, it was Abner that plunged in the knife. And because Abishai was there, David roped him in. But Abishai was not like his uncontrollable brother. Abishai was a more honourable man. He's mentioned as one of the mighty men in Chronicles by David. So, but you know, you wonder why David mourned for Abner. And perhaps some of the people thought, why are you mourning for Abner? Could he have been a potential traitor? Well, more than likely, yes, because we saw how he was reacting with Ishbosheth and behind the scenes of what his real motivation was. And perhaps Joab could see that. But you know what? I reckon that David saw in Abner something he didn't see in Joab. I think he saw an opportunity to change Abner's mind and Abner's character. Just like he'd changed many of his mighty warriors when they first met up with them, he was able to change them. So just maybe David saw something in Abner that he just never saw in Joab whatsoever. But it made no difference. Joab just did what he wanted to do. And you wonder to yourself, what sort of punishment did David give to Joab? What did he mete out for Joab? You remember when Ishbosheth was killed? Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who a pretty weak sort of a man, was placed into the kingship over the northern tribes, if you like, over Israel, over all 11 tribes except for Judah. And there's Ishbosheth, he's there, he's still the king. And 2 servants went in thinking they're going to do David a great big favour. And they lopped off the head of Ishbosheth, and they couldn't wait to tell David, David, we've just done you a big favour. We've got rid of the king up in the north, Ishbosheth. He would have caused you no end of trouble, and that might have been true. How did David respond to that? He grabbed hold of those 2 servants, he cut their heads off, and he executed them and made a public demonstration of what he felt about that. Doesn't do anything like that with Joab. Because I am powerless against that man. I don't know how to handle him. He is so difficult. Well, one thing we do know he did, and it's not in the record, but we know this is the case. He said, righto, Joab, you're fired. You're losing your position as captain of the army. And so he takes that prized position that Joab wanted. That was what he wanted to be. I want to be the captain of the army. That's what I grew up. My mindset was to be at the head of all the army, and I just wanted to be there. And David took it off him. But not for all that long, because he rescues it back again. He's like that clown we mentioned in the first class, you punch it down and boom, up it comes again, and he's going to raise his head again and get that position back. Because now we're going to very quickly look at David looking for another city to take, and he's going to take Jerusalem, and guess what? Joab raises his head yet again. So things have died down somewhat. Abner's dead, Ishbosheth is dead. It's now time to patch the difference up between Judah and the rest of Israel. So the north and the south had to combine together. David is going to be made king of the whole lot, and he needs a city to reign out of. Hebron's not suitable now. It's in the Judah's territory. He needs a city that is more central. So he eyes off none other, of course, than Jerusalem. And that is where he wants to make his headquarters as king over Israel. Now, Jerusalem at that time was known as Jebus. It's a Canaanite city. It had been, at this time, ruled by the Jebusites, and it had never been conquered in over 400 years. Many tribes, many other peoples had tried to conquer that city, and they had never been able to conquer it. So Joab grabs all these mighty men in his army, and he surrounds that city, and he's eyeing it all off, working out, what sort of strategy am I going to need to get into that city to conquer it and make that our city, our capital city? Well, the Jebusites are all standing on top of the walls, laughing their heads off at David. And I'm paraphrasing a lot of the quotes because we don't have time to look these up, but they're on the screen there anyway. In 2 Samuel 5, they're laughing their heads off at David and taunting him, saying, you know what, David, guess what? We could bring all our blind up and all our lame people up here and put them on the walls, and all our soldiers would go down basically and have a merry old time, and you still wouldn't get into this city, no matter how mighty you are. Well, of course, that's a red flag to David, isn't it? That taunting David in that fashion is just going to make him all the more determined. And he wanted this city to be the city that would weld Judah and the rest of the tribes, the rest of Israel together as their capital city. So he strategically thinks, how am I going to get hold of this particular city? So what does he do? He sets out a challenge. The challenge is outlined in 1 Chronicles 1. The challenge is very simple. He says, whoever can conquer that city, I am going to make them the captain or the commander-in-chief of my defence forces. Now, in my mind, I try to picture how all this played out. And I try to imagine David is standing there and he's yelling out this challenge to all these mighty men, and he's deliberately not making eye contact with Joab. Joab's over here, so he's not going to look at him, and he's looking at all these other mighty men, and he's kind of hoping that the likes of Shamar and Elhanan and Helez, and they were all wonderful mighty men that David named, and he's kind of hoping they're going to step up to the plate and take on this idea of taking Jerusalem. So he puts out the challenge. Whoever is going to do it, You are going to become the commander-in-chief. And Joab's over there, and that's where the voice comes from, in a big, booming, loud voice. I'll go. I'll be the one. And I just can imagine David putting his head in his hands going, oh, no, no, no. I don't want Joab in that position. It causes me nightmares. I can't sleep. It worries me. I can't control him. I don't want him in that position. But you know, when Joab says that in that record, 1 Chronicles 11, as soon as he says, I'll do it, not one other mighty warrior steps up to say, well, hang on, I wouldn't mind having a go either. Not one. And there were plenty of mighty men, really strong, tough men. Not one of them dare stand against Joab. That's the power this man had. That's the influence this man had. And when he took that city, wow, what a miracle that was in itself. Some of us have walked Hezekiah's tunnel, and we know the area in which Joab had to climb up the conduit up into the city. You really almost have to be like a Superman to do it, and he did it. He scaled the underwater cistern, and we're not going into this in any detail, where they had thought that nobody could ever do what Joab did, but he did, and he climbed up the tunnel, and he was able to get inside the city. It was an incredible feat on its own. And he got up into that city, and there's no doubt he probably fought a few soldiers on the way to those gates, 5-ton gates that were there, lifted off the great big bars of the gates himself with one sword in his hand, fighting the soldiers, lifting off the gates, bursting open the gates, and in comes David and all the mighty men. It was really like a miracle. It was an amazing feat. Heroic feat. It is no wonder, brothers and sisters and young people, it's no wonder all the people absolutely loved that man and adored him and admired him. Because everything he did seemed to be so amazing. The feat, the strength, the incredible endurance that man had. So guess what? He's bounced back again. David's got to honour his word. Joab's got the position back. He's now commander-in-chief. Remember we said he held that position 3 times. He got fired twice. Now he's back into this position. Well, everything is going along pretty smoothly. He wins back the captaincy. He keeps bouncing back. And then we're introduced to some of his amazing campaigns. Let's just look briefly at one. I just want to show you how amazing a strategist this man was when it came to warfare. It's no wonder David really did put a lot of emphasis on Joab helping out with his military campaigns, and David had quite a number of them. I just want to show you one. I want you to come to 2 Samuel chapter 10. Have a look at this. This is just brilliant. This is the man and how he thinks. And by the way, we're going to see here how he does have a little bit of a spirituality, a bit of a spiritual mind, which we're going to see in his comment that he makes. And we're not going to read these verses. I'm going to paraphrase it, but you can see it in 2 Samuel chapter 10. First 10 verses, very quickly, is all about the king of Ammon dying. Now, the king of Ammon had obviously shown quite a bit of kindness to David, and David felt like, well, he's dead now. His son Hanun is coming to reign. I just want to go and just give my sympathies and hope all's going well. And all good intentions by David. So he sends up some servants to Hanun. And Hanun, just like all newbies coming on the scenes, thinking, oh, how do I interpret this? Here comes David's servants. And he listens to his princes, you know. It's time and time again we see that happening in Scripture. He listens to ill advice. And they go and tell him, hey, listen, I wouldn't trust these servants. They're probably coming up to spy out the land. It wasn't what David's intention was. He had a very noble intentions of showing the sympathy to the king's son for having lost his father. Well, these servants, this king, Hanun and his men, grab hold of David's servants and they humiliate them. They shave half their beards off, make them look absolutely like clowns, cut half their robes off and sent them back to David. Now, it was a really humiliating, terrible way in which to treat this particular event. Well, it didn't take long before they realised that this had greatly upset David. And so they thought, uh-oh, big swallow, David's going to deal with this, what are we going to do? So they rush out and they grab 33,000 mercenaries from Syria. And there's going to be this, they think they've got the numbers, we're going to hold back David's men from attacking us. Well, what does David do? When David heard of this humiliation, this is verse 7, when David heard it, what does he do? He sends Joab. Joab, I need you to deal with this. You're the man I know will deal with it. Can you go and fix this issue up? I mean, who else is he going to pick? He can't pick anyone. He picks the captain of his army, but he's the obvious choice. And Joab, you could see him licking his lips and sharpening his sword and going, yep, you beauty, let's get down there and deal with it, because that's the type of man he was. And he goes down to the children of Ammon, and here's how the battle pans out. And it's the rest of the verses, so we're not going to deal with it in any detail, but I'll tell you what happened. The Ammonites were one army, and the mercenaries from Syria were the other army. And what they had done is they'd worked out how they were going to attack Joab and his mighty men. And when they saw what was going on, Joab looks, he's got the Ammonites ahead of him, and he looks behind, he's got the Syrians behind him. They were going to just come in like that and just destroy Joab's army, and that was going to be all over. Joab, Abishai was with him, felt outnumbered. So what they do is they get into a flanking position where they're back to back. So Joab's this way, with Abishai that way, facing that way. So Abishai's facing the Syrians, Joab's facing the Ammonites, and all their mighty men are in a great line doing the same thing, back to back. And Joab turns around to Abishai and says, hey, listen, if the Syrians get too hard for you to manage, I'll turn around and our men will turn around and help you. But if the Ammonites get a little bit hard for us, you turn around and you help us. This was a brilliant military strategy. It's like coming up against a brick wall where you've got reservists behind you to be able to help you fight. This is Joab's brilliant mind and brilliant strategy. But it's what Joab actually says that is quite important. Here's what he says in verses 11 and 12. Here it is. It's on the screen. If the Syrians are too strong for me, then I shall help, you can help me. If the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I'll come and help you. Be of good courage, he says, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God. And may Yahweh do what seems good to him. Now that's placing your trust in God without presuming that God should give you the victory. You know what he's saying? What we say every morning, every Sunday when we give the announcement. God willing. If it's God's will, we will get through this. That's what he's saying. So herein lies the complexity of Joab's character. Somewhere back in there, in the deep recesses of his mind, there is some form of a conscience, some sort of spirituality that comes out, and he means it. There's no doubt he means it in this particular case. Be of good courage, he goes on to say, and let us play the men for our people, for the cities of our God. May it happen according to Yahweh's will. And not only does he demonstrate this on this particular occasion, brothers and sisters, but he has this sporadic moments of spirituality in his life. We're not going to go through all of them, but there's a few of them that do stand out. There's this one, of course, which we've just talked about, where he does place everything in God's hands and makes that known to all his men that are with him. He uses actually complex matters of God's law to convince David to initially forgive Absalom. You know, when he sends the woman down and there was that rather convoluted story about, hey, you need to have Absalom back and so on. And it's really quite based on forgiveness and on the law and everything that Joab seemed to be opposed to, mercy, forgiveness and all of those things. And in the end, it was so, that whole story was so amazing and so influential to David that David turns around and says, is Joab behind this? He knew that Joab knew his Bible. He knew that Joab knew the law. He knew a lot of things about Joab, but unfortunately they were tucked away too far back in his mind to keep on coming to the surface. And then, of course, he understood the principles of God's law when he admonished David for wanting to number Israel. Now, I know there's different ways of understanding how that event played out, but Joab again could pick up at that particular occasion that it was wrong. And he had a mind that would think on spiritual levels at times. So anyway, he won that victory over Ammon and the Syrians. And he's now riding the crest of a wave. Everything's going so brilliantly for the man. He's loved even more now. He's got the position he wants. He has the respect he wants by everybody. His ego is being, exercised. He's loving the whole thing. And then comes the next chapter, chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, which is one of the lowest points in David's life, and I believe also one of the worst moments in Joab's life, because he was complicit with what actually went on in this entire event. Before we deal with that, let me just tell you the fear of Joab went beyond Israel. Talking to Max about this last week, and Max, thank you for bringing it up, because I had to search where this was, but it was really interesting. The fear of Joab went beyond Israel because previous to this, Joab, on it was actually the fourth military campaign against Edom, Joab took 6 months to kill all the males of Edom. They had to wipe out the male population of Edom. Joab was fighting this military campaign for 6 months, but a few got out of Edom. And one of those that got out was this man here, Hadad. Hadad got out of there when he was only a child, and he went down into Egypt. And there he stayed for years. He grew up, he got married, he married into Pharaoh's household. He was being treated like a king. They loved him down there. He had everything that was going for him. And then one day, he hears that Joab's dead. "You beauty," he says, "at long last I can now go back home." He dare not enter and head back into the Edom territory while Joab was still alive. That's the influence and the fear that Joab had in that region. Right down into Egypt, this man here says, "No way am I setting foot out of Egypt to go back home while that man is still alive." Quite interesting, isn't it? So let's have a little look at this complicity with covering up David's sin. Again, we're not dealing with this sin at all. Of course, David sadly dug himself a huge, massive hole of deceit which led to murder. And the only person that David felt was able to be a co-conspirator in all of this and help him in his vulnerable moment was Joab. He had no one he knew apart from Joab who would blindly uphold his orders to put Uriah, to make sure Uriah was killed in battle. In the hottest part of the battle, put him there, and I know that Joab's not going to ask any questions. And the fact that Joab didn't ask questions means to me that I think he knew what was going on. And he knew, I've got to protect David, because to protect David was to protect his own position. He had to protect David at all costs. So yes, he was as loyal as they come, but wow, what a mistake to hold back on correcting David on this occasion. Plus, there ended up being something else that ended up in Joab's hand, which I think really would have assisted Joab. We don't know whether he used this against David or not, but I'll tell you what, it was a pretty good trump card that he would have had in his hand, and that was the letter. David used Joab to the absolute fullest of Joab's utter loyalty to David, and he did that when it suited David. Here he is saying one moment, "Oh, you're just too hard for me, may God bring down, the punishments on your head because you deserve it and you're a wicked man." Suddenly, the two of them are like this. And David writes this letter. Joab, I've got a very, very good job for you to do, a top secret job for you. I want you to take Uriah, I want you to set him in the hottest part of the battle, and whatever you do not attempt to save him. Even if it looks as though he's going to be killed, do not attempt to save him. He's not to return home. That's pretty well what the letter said. Yours sincerely, your King David. Now, Joab would have known that's a dodgy order. That's a dodgy order that you've given me, David. Joab knew that Uriah was a very honourable man and he did not deserve to die in battle in this method. Joab vehemently, as we said before, he vehemently opposed David's orders to number Israel, but he doesn't do a thing here. He remains stony quiet, dead set quiet. So why didn't Joab question David's order to have Uriah killed? Well, as we've already said, protecting David was protecting himself. And I think when he got hold of this letter, he was a smart cookie, Joab was, a very smart man. I'll carry out this because I've got to protect myself. But you know what? This letter, I'll just fold that up and put it in my top pocket. And I'll make sure I've got that because I might need it sometime down the future. Because that could have been used very well in blackmail. So it unfolded in a dreadful manner, as we know, and we know the outcome of that particular story. Well, it doesn't end, of course, because the next event that happens after this event is Joab killing David's absolutely idolised son, Absalom. Now, arguably, this is one of the greatest and most difficult moments of tension that comes between these two men. David's adored son, idolised son, was about to be killed was killed at the hands of Joab. Now, we know that Joab had to be removed. He was toxic for Israel, toxic for David. He had to be removed. But yet again, Joab just goes out there, disobeys a direct order from David not to harm this man, this son of the king. Don't harm him at all. And he disobeys that order, and we know the story, not covering it yet again, but suffice it to say this, that this moment in David's life left David in arguably one of the most vulnerable positions he has ever been in, where he could have lost the kingship. This was an opportunity where Joab could have taken that position away from David and become the king. And he wouldn't have had any opposition from David's men, because at this stage David had alienated himself from his mighty men. And Joab could see all this going down, and he could have come in there and said, "Righto, David, you're too weak for this. Get out, go away. You're not king anymore. I'm taking control." He could have. It doesn't even enter his mind to do that. This is the complexity of the man. He wasn't interested in being the king. He just wanted his position. That was it. And so what he ends up doing, brothers and sisters, is he ends up shaking David out of this absolute moment of weakness. He's going to shake him out of this moment of absolute vulnerability. And it was some very wise words of counsel. However, there was one ingredient missing in his counsel to David on this particular occasion. See if you can pick up what it is. Here's how it goes down. This is the quote. 2 Samuel 19:5-7. Joab bursts in. David's crying his eyes out. My son's dead, oh Absalom, Absalom, my son, he's dead. And he's crying his eyes out. All the men are standing outside the palace. They can hear this weeping of the king. They're wondering, what on earth is going on? What's he crying for? What is happening? And in goes Joab into the king's room, and he says, "Now listen here, David." And he's pretty forthright. You can get that from the language in the Hebrew. You can see what's going on here. He says, "Stand up. Wake up yourself. What do you think you're doing?" Joab's the only one that can speak like this to David. He goes in there and says, wake up yourself, David. You know, today we just saved your life. We saved your son's life. We saved your concubine's life, your wife's life. We just saved your life. We put our life on the line to save yours. And you're making us feel ashamed of what we've done. You seem to love those that hate you and hate those that love you. Where's your mindset, David? What are you doing? You've made it very clear today that your commanders and your troops mean nothing to you. They've got no value whatsoever. It looks as though if Absalom had lived, he said, and we had all died, you'd be happy. Now, you need to get up off that ground. You need to be stopping your crying right here and now, and you need to go out there and you need to congratulate those men, because I'll tell you this, if you don't do that, there won't be one of those men still out there waiting to serve you by tomorrow morning. And your life will be far worse than it's ever been up until this point in time. Now, they were wise words of counsel. Make no mistake about it. David needed a bit of jolt of reality at this time. David was on the wrong wavelength, even spiritually, to be placing so much love and emphasis into this terrible son he had of Absalom. But there was still an ingredient missing in that comment by Joab, and you know what it was? Zero compassion. No mercy. There's no putting your arm around him and say, look, I can understand this. And he could have put it a different way. But no, he goes in. He's the type of man, hit hard, don't worry about the consequences. That's the way Joab did. That was Joab's life. No mercy, no compassion. Compassion to Joab was a sign of weakness. You won't find it in his life. It's a sign of weakness. And I don't know whether David was ever told the method in which Absalom died, but it was pretty horrendous. We know Absalom got his great, beautiful, long, flowing locks. Beautiful looking man, handsome. You know, everybody idolised him, adored him, and his hair got caught in the tree. And the servants come back and they tell Joab, guess what? Absalom's caught in the tree. And what's Joab say? Well, did you kill him? No, not touching the man. Didn't you hear the king's order? I wouldn't do it if you paid me $1 million. I'm not touching him. The king said, don't touch him. Get out of my way, Joab says. I don't have time to listen to this nonsense. And down he went and he saw Absalom in the tree, struggling like crazy. And without talking to him, without saying anything, he got 3 darts, whether they were arrows, whether they were daggers, whether they were javelins, I don't know. It just calls them darts. And he went up to him, and I could imagine him eyeing off Absalom, and he said, here we go. Boom, number 1, number 2, and number 3. And he strategically placed those darts so that the man didn't die. He didn't die. He's now hanging by his hair, struggling around, and Joab walks off and he leaves 10 more men to beat him up to death. That's how Absalom died. You read it. The record's there. That's a brutal killing. That's how Joab operated. Fear. Fear. Nobody dared take on Joab. No compassion, no mercy. Just get the job done. So that was another incident that we see in Joab's life, and we start to get a bit more of a picture of why David couldn't handle the man. Well, David again sacks Joab. This is the second sacking now. He sacks him. He says, I've had enough of this. You've killed Abner. You've killed my son Absalom. I've had enough. I've got to think strategy now. Joab, you're out of that position. I'm going to actually now put Amasa into the position. Now, Amasa was Joab's cousin, probably played together, a bit like maybe David and Joab. They're all maybe the same age. Amasa's the son of Abigail, David's sister. And he's a cousin, he's a nephew to David. And David sets Amasa up to be the commander-in-chief. Now, Amasa was actually the commander-in-chief of Absalom's army. So what David's thinking, you know what, Absalom's now dead. If I grab hold of Amasa and put him as head of my army, that actually might breach the gap between all those following Absalom and maybe it might show that, hey, I'm doing something quite, nice and merciful here, and I want to bring us all back together. I think there's a strategy involved in putting Amasa into this particular position. And the worst he could do to Joab was take that position away from him. And I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Joab would have been seething. Not again, David. Not again. And especially Amasa. I mean, he's the one we've been fighting against. He was my equivalent on the battlefield, on the enemy side. And you've put him as captain? He would not have been at all happy. And now comes another dimension of Joab's character. As if we didn't see it when he took on Absalom, we're going to definitely see how he handles Amasa. So Joab, I believe, sees Amasa as a traitor. He's another man in Joab's life that you can't trust. And he has taken Joab's spot as captain of the army. So here's some of we already know how proud Joab was, how he was jealous, how he was very vengeful, but now we're going to see just how cruel he can be. So I want to explain to you what he did to Amasa. And by the way, can I just say, and I'm just going back a little bit because it just came into my mind then, talking to Steve last week about when Abner was killed. All right, he was killed with a dagger straight into the stomach, and he died. But when Abner was killed, Abner was inside Hebron at the time when Joab was looking for him, and Hebron is a city of refuge. So if you don't think that Joab knew his Bible, you think about this. When he wanted to go and get Abner, he thought, oh, hang on, he's inside Hebron. That's a city of refuge. This could get legally very messy for me if I just go in there and kill him. So he goes, Abner, come out here. So he drags Abner out of the city to the gate. So now he's no longer in Hebron, so therefore he's not in the city of refuge, and therefore he kills Abner. He knew his Bible. He knew what this Bible was all about. He knew the law. He was a clever man. But he takes this to the next level when he deals with Amasa as far as cruelty is concerned. So here's what happens. Here it is in 2 Samuel 20, verses 8 to 12. And I'll paraphrase this, what goes on. He wants to get Amasa. So Amasa's coming along, and Amasa's got no need, no thought that Joab's going to have it in for him, because he doesn't show any sign of any awkwardness at all. He just comes up. Joab says, "Oh, Amasa, how are you?" But what Joab does is he has his sword tucked into his sheath, but he undoes it so that it actually falls out on the ground. As he's walking over, "Oh, Amasa, come on over. How are you, my cousin?" And then the sword falls out. "Oh, hang on a second." And he picks up the sword in his left hand, which he would not be of left-handed, he's probably a right-handed. So at this point in time, Amasa's not thinking anything. And Joab says, "Amasa, my cousin, come on over here." And he grabs him by the beard to give him a kiss, as they did in those days, a kiss on each cheek. "How are you?" Ooh! Straight up into the stomach, right there. Just one blow, it says. Not to kill him. Pulls the sword out, and out comes all the intestines and the blood oozing all over the ground. Amasa's just got this shocked look on his face. He falls down onto the ground, and the word is very descriptive. And there he lie, wallowing in his intestines and his blood, not dying straight away. And Joab looked at him and didn't put him out of his misery. Turned away and went away, and another soldier comes up and he looks, and everyone's looking. He's going, "This is not too good while this is going on." So they pick up Amasa, they take him over to the side of the road, they throw him in a ditch while he's still alive, and they throw a blanket over him. That's the cruelty of that man, Joab. We really shouldn't be admiring men like that, but I would say that many of his fellow soldiers and warriors probably thought, "Hey, you're going a bit far here. This is nothing but cruelty." But that's what happened, and it's unfortunate that Joab had these qualities, because he could have been so much better, but he wasn't. And now we get to the last few moments of his life. Amasa taken off the scene, of course. Guess what? Joab takes the reins again of being commander-in-chief. He takes that reign back again, and David's just beside himself. He's very, very distressed that this has happened. 3 times this has now happened to David. Abner, Absalom, and now Amasa. And as time went on and David was near the end of his life, and he's wanting to set, rightfully so, the heir to the throne, which is Solomon, up. And behind the scenes is going on a little bit of treason. And Adonijah, another Solomon's older brother, another son of David, is wanting to take the kingship and thinks he's got the numbers, a bit like Parliament, got to get the numbers to see who's going to follow you. Well, he thought, I've got it made because I've got Joab on my side. Adonijah thought, you beauty, who's going to ever be able to take me on? I've got Joab and I've got the priest. I've got Abiathar the priest. What more could I ask for? And he goes down and he goes out of the palace, and they set up this great big marquee to have a mighty big beautiful party to celebrate the fact that he's going to be made king. And David hears about it, and we know the story. Quickly sets Solomon up to become king, sounds of trumpets. The whole of the city are in absolute, great celebration, and Solomon's made king, and Adonijah and Joab are down and say, what's that I hear? What's going on? And they hear that Solomon's been made king, and everything goes pear-shaped for Adonijah, Joab and Abiathar. And it's got to be dealt with, not just at that point, but these men have to be dealt with, especially Joab. And so we read in our reading, come over to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 2. David says concerning Joab in 1 Kings chapter 2, we've got to deal with this man. And here's what he says in verse 5, 1 Kings chapter 2. Moreover, thou knowest also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the 2 captains of the hosts of Israel, Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he slew and shed the blood of war in peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle that was about his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet. That's just adding a little bit of more description as to how dreadful this whole idea of when Joab killed men during times of peace, that the blood not only splattered all over himself, it ran down his legs into his shoes. That's what that's saying. So what does David tell Solomon to do? Speaking to Solomon, he says, Solomon, according to your wisdom, don't, whatever you do, let Joab die of old age. Do not let his hoary head go down to the grave in peace. He has got to be taken out. But David couldn't do it himself. He couldn't bring himself to do it. He could not bring himself to be even an eyewitness to the death of one of his most loyal servants, but also the most spiritually reckless servant. He couldn't bring himself to even witness that this could take place. It had to happen after his death, and Solomon had to deal with it. It was left to the duty of Solomon. And look at what Solomon says. Oh, we've already read that. But we know what Solomon does, and he takes care of the matter. And what does Joab do? Well, the record says, as we read in 1 Kings 2, as Caleb read for us, he runs into the temple and he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Why would he grab hold of the horns of the altar? Well, the altar represents mercy and forgiveness. That's where the sacrifices went, right? That's where they all happen. And the horns were to tie down the sacrifices. So when you grabbed hold of the horns of the altar, it's like you're seeking to have mercy and forgiveness. In fact, if we won't go there because we haven't got time, in Amos chapter 3 verse 14, there's quite a good quotation there that would indicate the horns being exactly about mercy and forgiveness, because that's a time in Israel's history where the prophet Amos came along and said, no mercy anymore, you're about to be judged. God's going to chop the horns of the altar off. Don't even try and reach out and grab those horns of the altar, because you're not going to be shown any mercy and forgiveness. That was the inference in Amos chapter 3, verse 14. And why did he go in there and grab hold of that? Well, you know why, because it worked for Adonijah. Adonijah did the same thing. He ran into the temple and he grabbed hold of the horns of the altar, came to Solomon's notice, that was done, and Solomon said, well, let's give him one more chance. He is my brother, we'll give him one more chance. So maybe Joab's, thinking, well, if it worked for Adonijah, it might just happen to work for me. No, it wasn't going to work, and so in comes Benaiah. Let me read a commentator's words of the final moments of Joab's life, and this is how he portrays how it would have went down. Beads of sweat dotted across his brow, sharp pains jabbed from within the pit of his stomach, fueled by fear, desperation, helplessness and dread, his hands and fingers locked onto God's sacred altar, slipping from perspiration as he held on for dear life. And then he heard a noise. Someone was coming. Joab glanced over his shoulder and saw the shadow of his executioner stretch across the floor. The end was drawing near. As he cowered and he trembled, his face frozen in shock and horror, he knew that his plea for mercy would fall on deaf ears, and he accepted his final fate. He knew, all right, brothers and sisters and young people, because he never once showed mercy. He never once showed compassion. No point in him asking for it. We know there's multiple quotes in Scripture that we should be showing mercy and compassion in our life, and if we don't expect to get it at the judgment seat. That's exactly what was going on with Joab here on this occasion. Just an interesting few concluding slides here. Joab and Judas. Quite an interesting little connection here between the two. Both men betrayed another with a kiss. Both slew innocent blood. His blood be upon us and our children were phrases used for both Joab and Judas. Both were condemned in the temple. Both were buried in their own plot. You notice that in the last verse there, in verse 34 of 1 Kings 2, that he was buried in his own house in the wilderness. Joab was not buried in the family plot. He had his own little block of land stuck somewhere out in the desert. That's where they buried him. And both were buried in their own plot, not the family tomb. Both men were very self-centred, who never changed, and both had their position taken by another. Quite an interesting little, that you might get a bit of an understanding of the Old Testament type of Judas, if you like. And that was Joab. So let's conclude, brothers and sisters, with a few little pointers for us. I think the people had some lessons to learn when Joab was in their life and in their history, and I call it be careful of the 3 A's. Admiration. There's no doubt that everyone, including David, admired Joab. No doubt at all. Adoration. Many people would have adored Joab. And then adulation. Some people would have worshipped Joab. And unfortunately, they did it all for the wrong reasons. I guess we can admire. You might say, well, why would they admire? That's terrible. Why would you admire somebody like that hasn't got a spiritual bone in their body? Why would you do that? He did have a spiritual bone, but he just didn't show it very often. But why would you do that? And we sit there and go, that's terrible. I wouldn't admire anyone like that. Well, let me put these pictures on the screen. Let me ask you the question. How many of these people perhaps we might admire in our life? All right? There's nothing wrong with admiring people that perhaps have achieved something quite interesting in their life. I'm pretty certain we all admired the Queen. She deserved respect. She did live a very interesting and a very full life, and she did achieve a lot for her country. And we had an admiration for the Queen. But we've got to be careful we don't take it to the next level and we start, adoring these people. And we start worshipping these people and placing them on the adulation list, if you like, and suddenly we've got posters in the bedroom of them, or, you know, we know more about these people than we know about the Bible. And we follow them on Instagram, and these people, some of you probably don't know who they are, especially anyone from overseas looking at them, they probably don't. But you get the point, don't you, brothers and sisters and young people? We've got to be so careful we don't get carried away with our admiration. And the people of Israel did, and they got carried away, and in the end, Joab was untouchable because of those reasons. And Joab's motto in life, you know what it was? If you could put a motto in his life, very simple, and we know this: the end justifies the means. How easy is that for us to make that our motto? If it's a matter of principle, it doesn't matter how you uphold that principle. You do so at any cost. If it means stepping on brothers and sisters to uphold principles, quite often those principles are our own principles, by the way, not necessarily God's, then it doesn't matter. And that's the Joab coming out in us. We've got to be so careful, because what that is actually meaning, the end justifies the means, what that actually really means is simply this: if our objective is good in our own understanding, then it doesn't matter if the way we achieve it is wrong, bad or evil. And that's the takeaway lesson I get from Joab, because that's what he did all throughout his life. Keep David on the throne at all costs. Oh yeah, I'm going to benefit from that, no doubt about that. But that's what God wants. That's what he put him there for. Keep him there at all costs. The loyalty was huge to David, but I don't care how I go about doing it. And if it means shedding innocent blood, if it means shedding blood in peacetime, if it means stepping all over people, if it means cutting people down to size, I don't care. We've got a lesson, brothers and sisters, we can learn from this man's life, and I think that's the lesson I get from it, and I'm sure there's many other lessons we can get from it as well. So Joab, he was the merciless manipulator, and thus ends our rapid study on Joab's life. May we be very thankful, brothers and sisters, that God put people like that in the Bible, that we can learn from them and learn very carefully from their mistakes.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found the episode helpful. Don't forget, most of these episodes are also available as videos on our video channel, cdvideo.org. So head over and take a look. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please get in touch or leave us a voice message. We love to hear your feedback. You can email us at btf@cdvideo.org. If you enjoyed the episode, then please share it with others. Until next time, may God bless you in your studies and your walk towards God's kingdom. Amen.